8 days had passed. Now that it is all over and I am writing a record of it, we know all about it, but at the time we knew nothing, and it was natural that many things should seem strange to us. Stepan Trofimovich and I, anyway, shut ourselves up for the first part of the time, and looked on with dismay from a distance. I did, indeed, go about here and there, and, as before, brought him various items of news, without which he could not exist. I need hardly say that there were rumors of the most varied kind going about the town in regard to the blow that Stavrogin had received, Lizaveta Nikolaevna's fainting fit, and all that happened on that Sunday. But what we wondered was, through whom the story had got about so quickly and so accurately. Not one of the persons present had any need to give away the secret of what had happened, or interest to serve by doing so. The servants had not been present. Lebyadkin was the only one who might have chattered, not so much from spite, for he had gone out in great alarm, and fear of an enemy destroys spite against him, but simply from incontinence of speech. But Lebyadkin and his sister had disappeared next day, and nothing could be heard of them. There was no trace of them at Filipov's house. They had moved, no one knew where, and seemed to have vanished. Shatov, of whom I wanted to inquire about Marya Timofyevna, would not open his door, and I believe sat locked up in his room for the whole of those 8 days, even discontinuing his work in the town. He would not see me. I went to see him on Tuesday and knocked at his door. I got no answer, but being convinced by unmistakable evidence that he was at home, I knocked a second time. Then, jumping up, apparently from his bed, he strode to the door and shouted at the top of his voice, "Shatov is not at home." With that I went away. Stepan Trofimovich and I, not without dismay at the boldness of the supposition, though we tried to encourage one another, reached at last a conclusion. We made up our mind that the only person who could be responsible for spreading these rumors was Fyodor Stepanovich, though he himself not long after assured his father that he had found the story on everyone's lips, especially at the club, and that the governor and his wife were familiar with every detail of it. What is even more remarkable is that the next day, Monday evening, I met Liputin, and he knew every word that had been passed, so that he must have heard it first-hand. Many of the ladies, and some of the leading ones, were very inquisitive about the mysterious cripple, as they called Marya Timofyevna. There were some, indeed, who were anxious to see her and make her acquaintance, so the intervention of the persons who had been in such haste to conceal the Lebyatkins was timely. But Lizaveta Nikolaevna's fainting certainly took the foremost place in the story, and all society was interested, if only because it directly concerned Yulia Mihailovna, as the kinswoman and patroness of the young lady. And what was there they didn't say? What increased the gossip was the mysterious position of affairs. Both houses were obstinately closed. Lizaveta Nikolaevna, so they said, was in bed with brain fever. The same thing was asserted of Nikolai Syavolodovich, with the revolting addition of a tooth knocked out and a swollen face. It was even whispered in corners that there would soon be murder among us, that Stavrogin was not the man to put up with such an insult, and that he would kill Shatov, but with the secrecy of a Corsican vendetta. People liked this idea, but the majority of our young people listened with contempt, and with an air of the most nonchalant indifference, which was, of course, assumed. The old hostility to Nikolai Syavolodovich in the town was in general strikingly manifest. Even sober-minded people were eager to throw blame on him, though they could not have said for what. It was whispered that he had ruined Lizaveta Nikolaevna's reputation, and that there had been an intrigue between them in Switzerland. Cautious people, of course, restrained themselves, but all listened with relish. There were other things said, though not in public, but in private, on rare occasions and almost in secret, extremely strange things, to which I only refer to warn my readers of them with a view to the later events of my story. Some people, with knitted brows, said, God knows on what foundation, that Nikolai Syavolodovich had some special business in our province, that he had, through Count K., been brought into touch with exalted circles in Petersburg, that he was even, perhaps, in government service, and might almost be said to have been furnished with some sort of commission from someone. When very sober-minded and sensible people smiled at this rumor, observing very reasonably that a man always mixed up with scandals, and who was beginning his career among us with a swollen face, did not look like a government official. They were told in a whisper that he was employed not in the official, but, so to say, the confidential service, and that in such cases it was essential to be as little like an official as possible. This remark produced a sensation. We knew that the Zemstvo of our province was the object of marked attention in the capital. I repeat, these were only flitting rumors that disappeared for a time when Nikolai Vsyevolodovich first came among us. But I may observe that many of the rumors were partly due to a few brief but malicious words, vaguely and disconnectedly dropped at the club by a gentleman who had lately returned from Petersburg. This was a retired captain in the Guards, Artemy Pavlovich Gaganov. He was a very large landowner in our province and district, a man used to the society of Petersburg, and a son of the late Pavel Pavlovich Gaganov, the venerable old man with whom Nikolai Vsyevolodovich had, over 4 years before, had the extraordinarily coarse and sudden encounter which I have described already in the beginning of my story. It immediately became known to everyone that Yulia Mihailovna had made a special call on Varvara Petrovna, and had been informed at the entrance, her honor was too unwell to see visitors. It was known, too, that Yulia Mihailovna sent a message 2 days later to inquire after Varvara Petrovna's health. At last she began defending Varvara Petrovna everywhere, of course only in the loftiest sense, that is, in the vaguest possible way. She listened coldly and sternly to the hurried remarks made at first about the scene on Sunday, so that during the later days they were not renewed in her presence. So that the belief gained ground everywhere that Yulia Mihailovna knew not only the whole of the mysterious story but all its secret significance to the smallest detail, and not as an outsider, but as one taking part in it. I may observe, by the way, that she was already gradually beginning to gain that exalted influence among us for which she was so eager and which she was certainly struggling to win, and was already beginning to see herself surrounded by a circle. A section of society recognized her practical sense and tact, but of that later. Her patronage partly explained Fyodor Stepanovich's rapid success in our society, a success with which Stepan Trofimovich was particularly impressed at the time. We possibly exaggerated it. To begin with, Fyodor Stepanovich seemed to make acquaintance almost instantly with the whole town within the first 4 days of his arrival. He only arrived on Sunday, and on Tuesday I saw him in a carriage with Artemy Pavlovich Gaganov, a man who was proud, irritable, and supercilious, in spite of his good breeding, and who was not easy to get on with. At the governor's, too, Fyodor Stepanovich met with a warm welcome, so much so that he was at once on an intimate footing, like a young friend, treated, so to say, affectionately. He dined with Yulia Mihailovna almost every day. He had made her acquaintance in Switzerland, but there was certainly something curious about the rapidity of his success in the governor's house. In any case, he was reputed, whether truly or not, to have been at one time a revolutionist abroad. He had had something to do with some publications and some congresses abroad, which one can prove from the newspapers, to quote the malicious remark of Alyosha Telyatnikov, who had also been once a young friend affectionately treated in the house of the late governor, but was now, alas, a clerk on the retired list. But the fact was unmistakable. The former revolutionist, far from being hindered from returning to his beloved fatherland, seemed almost to have been encouraged to do so, so perhaps there was nothing in it. Liputin whispered to me once that there were rumors that Fyodor Stepanovich had once professed himself penitent, and on his return had been pardoned on mentioning certain names, and so, perhaps, had succeeded in expiating his offense, by promising to be of use to the government in the future. I repeated these malignant phrases to Stepan Trofimovich, and although the latter was in such a state that he was hardly capable of reflection, he pondered profoundly. It turned out later that Fyodor Stepanovich had come to us with a very influential letter of recommendation, that he had, at any rate, brought one to the governor's wife from a very important old lady in Petersburg, whose husband was one of the most distinguished old dignitaries in the capital. This old lady, who was Yulia Mihailovna's godmother, mentioned in her letter that Count K. knew Fyodor Stepanovich very well through Nikolai Vsyevolodovich, made much of him, and thought him a very excellent young man in spite of his former errors. Yulia Mihailovna set the greatest value on her relations with the higher spheres, which were few and maintained with difficulty, and was, no doubt, pleased to get the old lady's letter, but still there was something peculiar about it. She even forced her husband upon a familiar footing with Fyodor Stepanovich, so much so that Mr. von Lemke complained of it, but of that, too, later. I may mention, too, that the great author was also favorably disposed to Fyodor Stepanovich, and at once invited him to go and see him. Such alacrity on the part of a man so puffed up with conceit stung Stepan Trofimovich more painfully than anything, but I put a different interpretation on it. In inviting a nihilist to see him, Mr. Karmazinov, no doubt, had in view his relations with the progressives of the younger generation in both capitals. The great author trembled nervously before the revolutionary youth of Russia, and imagining, in his ignorance, that the future lay in their hands, fawned upon them in a despicable way, chiefly because they paid no attention to him whatever. 2. Fyodor Stepanovich ran round to see his father twice, but unfortunately I was absent on both occasions. He visited him for the first time only on Wednesday, that is, not till the fourth day after their first meeting, and then only on business. Their difficulties over the property were settled, by the way, without fuss or publicity. Varvara Petrovna took it all on herself, and paid all that was owing, taking over the land, of course, and only informed Stepan Trofimovich that it was all settled, and her butler, Alexey Yegorich, was, by her authorization, bringing him something to sign. This Stepan Trofimovich did, in silence, with extreme dignity. Apropos of his dignity, I may mention that I hardly recognized my old friend during those days. He behaved as he had never done before, became amazingly taciturn, and had not even written one letter to Varvara Petrovna since Sunday, which seemed to me almost a miracle. What's more, he had become quite calm. He had fastened upon a final and decisive idea which gave him tranquility. That was evident. He had hit upon this idea, and sat still, expecting something. At first, however, he was ill, especially on Monday. He had an attack of his summer cholera. He could not remain all that time without news either, but as soon as I departed from the statement of facts, and began discussing the case in itself, and formulated any theory, he at once gesticulated to me to stop. But both his interviews with his son had a distressing effect on him, though they did not shake his determination. After each interview he spent the whole day lying on the sofa with a handkerchief soaked in vinegar on his head. But he continued to remain calm in the deepest sense. Sometimes, however, he did not hinder my speaking. Sometimes, too, it seemed to me that the mysterious determination he had taken seemed to be failing him, and he appeared to be struggling with a new, seductive stream of ideas. That was only at moments, but I made a note of it. I suspected that he was longing to assert himself again, to come forth from his seclusion, to show fight, to struggle to the last. I could crush them, broke from him on Thursday evening after his second interview with Fyodor Stepanovich, when he lay stretched on the sofa with his head wrapped in a towel. Till that moment he had not uttered one word all day. Fills, share, and so on. I agree all those expressions are nonsense, kitchen talk, and so be it. I see it for myself. I never gave him food or drink. I sent him a tiny baby from Berlin to Aix-Provence by post, and all that, I admit it. You gave me neither food nor drink, and sent me by post, he says, and what's more, you've robbed me here. But you unhappy boy, I cried to him, my heart has been aching for you all my life, though I did send you by post. Il writ. But I admit it. Granted it was by post, he concluded, almost in delirium. Passons, he began again, 5 minutes later. I don't understand Turgenev. That Bazarov of his is a fictitious figure, it does not exist anywhere. The fellows themselves were the first to disown him as unlike anyone. That Bazarov is a sort of indistinct mixture of Nozdryov and Byron, say l'Mot. Look at them attentively, they caper about and squeal with joy like puppies in the sun. They are happy, they are victorious. What is there of Byron in them? And with that, such ordinariness. What a low-bred, irritable vanity. What an abject craving to faire du brute auteur de son nom, without noticing that son nom. Oh, it's a caricature. Surely, I cried to him, you don't want to offer yourself just as you are as a substitute for Christ? Il rit. Il rit beaucoup. Il rit trop. He has a strange smile. His mother had not a smile like that. Il rit toujours. Silence followed again. They are cunning, they were acting in collusion on Sunday, he blurted out suddenly. Oh, not a doubt of it, I cried, pricking up my ears. It was a got-up thing and it was too transparent, and so badly acted. I don't mean that. Do you know that it was all too transparent on purpose, that those, who had to, might understand it? Do you understand that? I don't understand. Tant mieux, passons. I am very irritable today. But why have you been arguing with him, Stepan Trofimovitch? I asked him reproachfully. Je voulais converter, you'll laugh of course, said pauvre auntie, elle entendre de belles choses. Oh, my dear boy, would you believe it? I felt like a patriot. I always recognized that I was a Russian, however, a genuine Russian must be like you and me. Il y a dedans quelque chose d'aveuglité de louche. Not a doubt of it, I assented. My dear, the real truth always sounds improbable, do you know that? To make truth sound probable you must always mix in some falsehood with it. Men have always done so. Perhaps there's something in it that passes our understanding. What do you think? Is there something we don't understand in that triumphant squeal? I should like to think there was. I should like to think so. I did not speak. He, too, was silent for a long time. They say that French cleverness, he babbled suddenly, as though in a fever. That's false, it always has been. Why libel French cleverness? It's simply Russian indolence, our degrading impotence to produce ideas, our revolting parasitism in the rank of nations. Ils sont tout simplement des parasites, and not French cleverness. Oh, the Russians ought to be extirpated for the good of humanity, like noxious parasites. We've been striving for something utterly, utterly different. I can make nothing of it. I have given up understanding. Do you understand, I cried to him, that if you have the guillotine in the foreground of your program and are so enthusiastic about it too, it's simply because nothing's easier than cutting off heads, and nothing's harder than to have an idea. Vous êtes de paresseux. Votre drapeau est un ganil, en impuissance. It's those carts, or what was it? The rumble of the carts carrying bread to humanity being more important than the Sistine Madonna, or, what's the saying? Un bêtise dans ce genre. Don't you understand, I said to him, that unhappiness is just as necessary to man as happiness. Il rit. All you do is to make a bon émote, he said, with your limbs snug on a velvet sofa. He used a coarser expression. And this habit of addressing a father so familiarly is very nice when father and son are on good terms, but what do you think of it when they are abusing one another? We were silent again for a minute. Cher, he concluded at last, getting up quickly, do you know this is bound to end in something? Of course, said I. Vous n'y comprenez pas. Passons. But, usually in our world things come to nothing, but this will end in something. It's bound to. He got up, and walked across the room in violent emotion, and coming back to the sofa sank onto it exhausted. On Friday morning, Fyodor Stepanovitch went off somewhere in the neighborhood, and remained away till Monday. I heard of his departure from Liputin, and in the course of conversation I learned that the Lebyatkins, brother and sister, had moved to the riverside quarter. I moved them, he added, and, dropping the Lebyatkins, he suddenly announced to me that Lizaveta Nikolaevna was going to marry Mavriky Nikolaevich, that, although it had not been announced, the engagement was a settled thing. Next day I met Lizaveta Nikolaevna out riding with Mavriky Nikolaevich. She was out for the first time after her illness. She beamed at me from the distance, laughed, and nodded in a very friendly way. I told all this to Stepan Trofimovich. He paid no attention, except to the news about the Lebyatkins. And now, having described our enigmatic position throughout those 8 days during which we knew nothing, I will pass on to the description of the succeeding incidents of my chronicle, writing, so to say, with full knowledge, and describing things as they became known afterwards, and are clearly seen today. I will begin with the 8th day after that Sunday, that is, the Monday evening, for in reality a new scandal began with that evening. 3. It was 7 o'clock in the evening. Nikolai Syavolodovich was sitting alone in his study, the room he had been fond of in old days. It was lofty, carpeted with rugs, and contained somewhat heavy old-fashioned furniture. He was sitting on the sofa in the corner, dressed as though to go out, though he did not seem to be intending to do so. On the table before him stood a lamp with a shade. The sides and corners of the big room were left in shadow. His eyes looked dreamy and concentrated, not altogether tranquil. His face looked tired and had grown a little thinner. He really was ill with a swollen face, but the story of a tooth having been knocked out was an exaggeration. One had been loosened, but it had grown into its place again. He had had a cut on the inner side of the upper lip, but that, too, had healed. The swelling on his face had lasted all the week simply because the invalid would not have a doctor, and instead of having the swelling lanced had waited for it to go down. He would not hear of a doctor, and would scarcely allow even his mother to come near him, and then only for a moment, once a day, and only at dusk, after it was dark and before lights had been brought in. He did not receive Fyodor Stepanovich either, though the latter ran round to Varvara Petrovna's 2 or 3 times a day so long as he remained in the town. And now, at last, returning on the Monday morning after his 3 days' absence, Fyodor Stepanovich made a circuit of the town, and, after dining at Yulia Mihailovna's, came at last in the evening to Varvara Petrovna, who was impatiently expecting him. The interdict had been removed. Nikolai Syavolodovich was at home. Varvara Petrovna herself led the visitor to the door of the study. She had long looked forward to their meeting, and Fyodor Stepanovich had promised to run to her and repeat what passed. She knocked timidly at Nikolai Syavolodovitch's door, and getting no answer ventured to open the door a couple of inches. "Nicholas, may I bring Fyodor Stepanovich in to see you?" she asked, in a soft and restrained voice, trying to make out her son's face behind the lamp. You can, of course you can," Fyodor Stepanovich himself cried out, loudly and gaily. He opened the door with his hand and went in. Nikolai Syavolodovich had not heard the knock at the door, and only caught his mother's timid question, and had not had time to answer it. Before him, at that moment, there lay a letter he had just read over, which he was pondering deeply. He started, hearing Fyodor Stepanovich's sudden outburst, and hurriedly put the letter under a paper weight, but did not quite succeed. A corner of the letter and almost the whole envelope showed. "I called out on purpose that you might be prepared," Fyodor Stepanovich said hurriedly, with surprising naivete, running up to the table, and instantly staring at the corner of the letter, which peeped out from beneath the paper weight. "And no doubt you had time to see how I hid the letter I had just received, under the paper weight," said Nikolai Syavolodovich calmly, without moving from his place. "A letter? Bless you and your letters, what are they to do with me?" cried the visitor. "But, what does matter?" he whispered again, turning to the door, which was by now closed, and nodding his head in that direction. "She never listens," Nikolai Syavolodovich observed coldly. "What if she did overhear?" cried Fyodor Stepanovich, raising his voice cheerfully, and settling down in an armchair. I've nothing against that, only I've come here now to speak to you alone. Well, at last I've succeeded in getting at you. First of all, how are you? I see you're getting on splendidly. Tomorrow you'll show yourself again, eh? Perhaps. Set their minds at rest. Set mine at rest at last. He gesticulated violently with a jocose and amiable air. If only you knew what nonsense I've had to talk to them. You know, though. He laughed. I don't know everything. I only heard from my mother that you've been very active. Oh, well, I've said nothing definite. Fyodor Stepanovich flared up at once, as though defending himself from an awful attack. I simply trotted out Shadow's wife, you know, that is, the rumors of your liaison in Paris, which accounted, of course, for what happened on Sunday. You're not angry? I'm sure you've done your best. Oh, that's just what I was afraid of. Though what does that mean, done your best? That's a reproach, isn't it? You always go straight for things, though. What I was most afraid of, as I came here, was that you wouldn't go straight for the point. I don't want to go straight for anything, said Nikolai Vsyevolodovich with some irritation. But he laughed at once. I didn't mean that, don't make a mistake, cried Fyodor Stepanovich, waving his hands, rattling his words out like peas, and at once relieved at his companion's irritability. I'm not going to worry you with our business, especially in your present position. I've only come about Sunday's affair, and only to arrange the most necessary steps, because, you see, it's impossible. I've come with the frankest explanations which I stand in more need of than you, so much for your vanity, but at the same time it's true. I've come to be open with you from this time forward. Then you have not been open with me before? You know that yourself. I've been cunning with you many times, you smile, I'm very glad of that smile as a prelude to our explanation. I provoked that smile on purpose by using the word cunning, so that you might get cross directly at my daring to think I could be cunning, so that I might have a chance of explaining myself at once. You see how open I have become now. Well, do you care to listen? In the expression of Nikolai Vsyevolodovitch's face, which was contemptuously composed, and even ironical, in spite of his visitor's obvious desire to irritate him by the insolence of his premeditated and intentionally coarse naïvetés, there was, at last, a look of rather uneasy curiosity. Listen, said Fyodor Stepanovich, wriggling more than ever, when I set off to come here, I mean here in the large sense, to this town, 10 days ago, I made up my mind, of course, to assume a character. It would have been best to have done without anything, to have kept one's own character, wouldn't it? There is no better dodge than one's own character, because no one believes in it. I meant, I must own, to assume the part of a fool, because it is easier to be a fool than to act one's own character, but as a fool is after all something extreme, and anything extreme excites curiosity, I ended by sticking to my own character. And what is my own character? The golden mean, neither wise nor foolish, rather stupid, and dropped from the moon, as sensible people say here, isn't that it? Perhaps it is, said Nikolai Vsyevolodovich, with a faint smile. Ah, you agree, I'm very glad, I knew beforehand that it was your own opinion. You needn't trouble, I am not annoyed, and I didn't describe myself in that way to get a flattering contradiction from you. No, you're not stupid, you're clever. Ah! You're smiling again. I've blundered once more. You would not have said you're clever, granted, I'll let it pass anyway. Passons, as Papa says, and, in parenthesis, don't be vexed with my verbosity. By the way, I always say a lot, that is, use a great many words and talk very fast, and I never speak well. And why do I use so many words, and why do I never speak well? Because I don't know how to speak. People who can speak well, speak briefly. So that I am stupid, am I not? But as this gift of stupidity is natural to me, why shouldn't I make skillful use of it? And I do make use of it. It's true that as I came here, I did think, at first, of being silent. But you know silence is a great talent, and therefore incongruous for me, and secondly silence would be risky, anyway. So I made up my mind finally that it would be best to talk, but to talk stupidly, that is, to talk, to be in a tremendous hurry to explain things, and in the end to get muddled in my own explanations, so that my listener would walk away without hearing the end, with a shrug, or, better still, with a curse. You succeed straight off in persuading them of your simplicity, in boring them and in being incomprehensible, 3 advantages all at once. Do you suppose anybody will suspect you of mysterious designs after that? Why, every one of them would take it as a personal affront if anyone were to say I had secret designs. And I sometimes amuse them too, and that's priceless. Why, they're ready to forgive me everything now, just because the clever fellow who used to publish manifestos out there turns out to be stupider than themselves. That's so, isn't it? From your smile I see you approve. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich was not smiling at all, however. On the contrary, he was listening with a frown and some impatience. What? I believe you said no matter. Fyodor Stepanovich rattled on. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich had said nothing at all. Of course. I assure you I'm not here to compromise you by my company, by claiming you as my comrade. But do you know you're horribly captious today? I ran into you with a light and open heart, and you seem to be laying up every word I say against me. I assure you I'm not going to begin about anything shocking today, I give you my word, and I agree beforehand to all your conditions. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich was obstinately silent. What? Did you say something? I see that I've made a blunder again, it seems. You've not suggested conditions and you're not going to. I believe you. Well, you can set your mind at rest. I know, of course, that it's not worthwhile for me to suggest them, is it? I'll answer for you beforehand, and it just from stupidity, of course, stupidity again. You're laughing? What? Nothing, Nikolai Vsyevolodovich laughed at last. I just remembered that I really did call you stupid, but you weren't there then, so they must have repeated it. I would ask you to make haste and come to the point. Why, but I am at the point. I am talking about Sunday, babbled Fyodor Stepanovich. Why, what was I on Sunday? What would you call it? Just fussy, mediocre stupidity, and in the stupidest way I took possession of the conversation by force. But they forgave me everything, first because I dropped from the moon, that seems to be settled here, now, by everyone, and, secondly, because I told them a pretty little story, and got you all out of a scrape, didn't they? That is, you told your story so as to leave them in doubt and suggest some compact and collusion between us, when there was no collusion and I'd not asked you to do anything. Just so. Fyodor Stepanovich caught him up, apparently delighted. That's just what I did do, for I wanted you to see that I implied it. I exerted myself chiefly for your sake, for I caught you and wanted to compromise you. Above all, I wanted to find out how far you're afraid. It would be interesting to know why you are so open now. Don't be angry, don't glare at me. You're not, though. You wonder why I am so open? Why, just because it's all changed now, of course, it's over, buried under the sand. I've suddenly changed my ideas about you. The old way is closed, now I shall never compromise you in the old way, it will be in a new way now. You've changed your tactics? There are no tactics. Now it's for you to decide in everything, that is, if you want to, say yes, and if you want to, say no. There you have my new tactics. And I won't say a word about our cause till you bid me yourself. You laugh? laugh away. I'm laughing myself. But I'm in earnest now, in earnest, though a man who is in such a hurry is stupid, isn't he? Never mind, I may be stupid, but I'm in earnest, He really was speaking in earnest in quite a different tone, and with a peculiar excitement, so that Nikolai Syabolodovich looked at him with curiosity. You say you've changed your ideas about me? He asked. I changed my ideas about you at the moment when you drew your hands back after Shadov's attack, and that's enough, no questions, please, I'll say nothing more now. He jumped up, waving his hands as though waving off questions. But as there were no questions, and he had no reason to go away, he sank into an armchair again, somewhat reassured. By the way, in parenthesis, he rattled on at once, some people here are babbling that you'll kill him, and taking bets about it, so that Lemka positively thought of setting the police on, but Yulia Mihailovna forbade it. But enough about that, quite enough, I only spoke of it to let you know. By the way, I moved the Lebyatkins the same day, did you get my note with their address? I received it at the time. I didn't do that by way of stupidity. I did it genuinely, to serve you. If it was stupid, anyway, it was done in good faith. Oh, all right, perhaps it was necessary, said Nikolai Syabolodovich dreamily, only don't write any more letters to me, I beg you. Impossible to avoid it. It was only one. So Liputin knows? Impossible to help it, but Liputin, you know yourself, dare not. By the way, you ought to meet our fellows, that is, the fellows not our fellows, or you'll be finding fault again. Don't disturb yourself, not just now, but sometime. Just now it's raining. I'll let them know, they'll meet together, and we'll go in the evening. They're waiting, with their mouths open like young crows in a nest, to see what present we've brought them. They're a hot-headed lot. They've brought out leaflets, they're on the point of quarreling. Virginsky is a universal humanity man, Liputin is a Fourierist with a marked inclination for police work, a man, I assure you, who is precious from one point of view, though he requires strict supervision in all others, and, last of all, that fellow with the long ears, he'll read an account of his own system. And do you know, they're offended at my treating them casually, and throwing cold water over them, but we certainly must meet. You've made me out some sort of chief? Nikolai Syabolodovich dropped as carelessly as possible. Fyodor Stepanovich looked quickly at him. By the way, he interposed, in haste to change the subject, as though he had not heard. I've been here 2 or 3 times, to see Her Excellency, Varvara Petrovna, and I have been obliged to say a great deal too. So I imagine. No, don't imagine, I've simply told her that you won't kill him, well, and other sweet things. And only fancy, the very next day she knew I'd moved Maria Timofyevna beyond the river. Was it you told her? I never dreamed of it. I knew it wasn't you. Who else could it be? It's interesting. Liputin, of course. And no, not Liputin, muttered Pyotr Stepanovich, frowning, I'll find out who. It's more like Shadov. That's nonsense though. Let's leave that. Though it's awfully important. By the way, I kept expecting that your mother would suddenly burst out with the great question. ACH. Yes, she was horribly glum at first, but suddenly, when I came today, she was beaming all over. What does that mean? It's because I promised her today that within 5 days I'll be engaged to Lizaveta Nikolaevna, Nikolai Syabolodovich said with surprising openness. Oh. Yes, of course, faltered Pyotr Stepanovich, seeming disconcerted. There are rumors of her engagement, It's true, too. But you're right, she'd run from under the wedding crown, you've only to call to her. You're not angry at my saying so? No, I'm not angry. I notice it's awfully hard to make you angry today, and I begin to be afraid of you. I'm awfully curious to know how you'll appear tomorrow. I expect you've got a lot of things ready. You're not angry at my saying so? Nikolai Vsyevolodovich made no answer at all, which completed Pyotr Stepanovitch's irritation. By the way, did you say that in earnest to your mother, about Lizaveta Nikolaevna? He asked. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich looked coldly at him. Oh, I understand, it was only to soothe her, of course. And if it were in earnest? Nikolai Vsyevolodovich asked firmly. Oh, God bless you then, as they say in such cases. It won't hinder the cause, you see. I don't say are, you don't like the word are, and I am at your service, as you know. You think so? I think nothing, Pyotr Stepanovich hurriedly declared, laughing, because I know you consider what you're about beforehand for yourself, and everything with you has been thought out. I only mean that I am seriously at your service, always and everywhere, and in every sort of circumstance, every sort really, do you understand that? Nikolai Vsyevolodovich yawned. I've bored you, Pyotr Stepanovich cried, jumping up suddenly, and snatching his perfectly new round hat as though he were going away. He remained and went on talking, however, though he stood up, sometimes pacing about the room and tapping himself on the knee with his hat at exciting parts of the conversation. I meant to amuse you with stories of the Lemkas, too, he cried gaily. Afterwards, perhaps, not now. But how is Yulia Mihailovna? What conventional manners all of you have! Her health is no more to you than the health of the grey cat, yet you ask after it. I approve of that. She's quite well, and her respect for you amounts to a superstition. Her immense anticipations of you amount to a superstition. She does not say a word about what happened on Sunday, and is convinced that you will overcome everything yourself by merely making your appearance. Upon my word! She fancies you can do anything. You're an enigmatic and romantic figure now, more than ever you were extremely advantageous position. It is incredible how eager everyone is to see you. They were pretty hot when I went away, but now it is more so than ever. Thanks again for your letter. They are all afraid of Count K. Do you know they look upon you as a spy? I keep that up, you're not angry? It does not matter. It does not matter, it's essential in the long run. They have their ways of doing things here. I encourage it, of course, Yulia Mihailovna, in the first place, Gaganov too. You laugh? But you know I have my policy, I babble away and suddenly I say something clever just as they are on the lookout for it. They crowd round me and I humbug away again. They've all given me up in despair by now. He's got brains but he's dropped from the moon. Lemka invites me to enter the service so that I may be reformed. You know I treat him mockingly, that is, I compromise him and he simply stares. Yulia Mihailovna encourages it. Oh, by the way, Gaganov is in an awful rage with you. He said the nastiest things about you yesterday at Duhovo. I told him the whole truth on the spot, that is, of course, not the whole truth. I spent the whole day at Duhovo. It's a splendid estate, a fine house. Then is he at Duhovo now? Nikolai Vsyevolodovich broke in suddenly, making a sudden start forward and almost leaping up from his seat. No, he drove me here this morning, we returned together, said Pyotr Stepanovich, appearing not to notice Stavrogin's momentary excitement. What's this? I dropped a book. He bent down to pick up the keepsake he had knocked down. The Women of Balzac, with illustrations. He opened it suddenly. I haven't read it. Lemka writes novels too. Yes, queried Nikolai Syavolodovich, as though beginning to be interested. In Russian, on the sly, of course, Yulia Mihailovna knows and allows it. He's henpecked, but with good manners, it's their system. Such strict form, such self-restraint. Something of the sort would be the thing for us. You approve of government methods? I should rather think so. It's the one thing that's natural and practicable in Russia. I won't, he cried out suddenly. I'm not referring to that, not a word on delicate subjects. Goodbye, though, you look rather green. I'm feverish. I can well believe it, you should go to bed. By the way, there are Skoptsi here in the neighborhood, they're curious people, of that later, though. Ah, here's another anecdote. There's an infantry regiment here in the district. I was drinking last Friday evening with the officers. We've 3 friends among them, vous comprenez? They were discussing atheism and I need hardly say they made short work of God. They were squealing with delight. By the way, Shatov declares that if there's to be a rising in Russia we must begin with atheism. Maybe it's true. One grizzled old stager of a captain sat mum, not saying a word. All at once he stands up in the middle of the room and says aloud, as though speaking to himself, if there's no God, how can I be a captain then? He took up his cap and went out, flinging up his hands. He expressed a rather sensible idea, said Nikolai Syavolodovich, yawning for the 3rd time. Yes? I didn't understand it, I meant to ask you about it. Well, what else have I to tell you? The Spigulin factory's interesting, as you know, there are 500 workmen in it, it's a hotbed of cholera, it's not been cleaned for 15 years and the factory hands are swindled. The owners are millionaires. I assure you that some among the hands have an idea of the Internationale. What, you smile? You'll see, only give me ever so little time. I've asked you to fix the time already and now I ask you again and then. But I beg your pardon, I won't speak of that, don't frown. There. He turned back suddenly. I quite forgot the chief thing. I was told just now that our box had come from Petersburg. You mean? Nikolai Syavolodovich looked at him, not understanding. Your box, your things, coats, trousers, and linen have come. Is it true? Yes, they said something about it this morning. ACH, then can't I open it at once? Ask Alexei. Well, tomorrow, then, will tomorrow do? You see my new jacket, dress coat and 3 pairs of trousers are with your things, from Sharmer's, by your recommendation, do you remember? I hear you're going in for being a gentleman here, said Nikolai Syavolodovich with a smile. Is it true you're going to take lessons at the riding school? Fyodor Stepanovich smiled a wry smile. I say, he said suddenly, with excessive haste in a voice that quivered and faltered, I say, Nikolai Syavolodovich, let's drop personalities once for all. Of course, you can despise me as much as you like if it amuses you, but we'd better dispense with personalities for a time, hadn't we? All right, Nikolai Syavolodovich assented. Fyodor Stepanovich grinned, tapped his knee with his hat, shifted from one leg to the other, and recovered his former expression. Some people here positively look upon me as your rival with Lizaveta Nikolaevna, so I must think of my appearance, mustn't I? He laughed. Who was it told you that though? It's just 8 o'clock, well I must be off. I promised to look in on Varvara Petrovna, but I shall make my escape. And you go to bed and you'll be stronger tomorrow. It's raining and dark, but I've a cab, it's not over safe in the streets here at night. By the way, there's a runaway convict from Siberia, Fedka, wandering about the town and the neighborhood. Only fancy, he used to be a serf of mine, and my papa sent him for a soldier 15 years ago and took the money for him. He's a very remarkable person. You have been talking to him? Nikolai Vsyevolodovich scanned him. I have. He lets me know where he is. He's ready for anything, for money of course, but he has convictions, too, of a sort, of course. Oh yes, by the way, again, if you meant anything of that plan, you remember, about Lizaveta Nikolaevna, I tell you once again, I too am a fellow ready for anything of any kind you like, and absolutely at your service. Hello? Are you reaching for your stick? Oh no, only fancy. I thought you were looking for your stick. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich was looking for nothing and said nothing. But he had risen to his feet very suddenly with a strange look in his face. If you want any help about Mr. Gaganov either, Fyodor Stepanovich blurted out suddenly, this time looking straight at the paperweight, of course I can arrange it all, and I'm certain you won't be able to manage without me. He went out suddenly without waiting for an answer, but thrust his head in at the door once more. I mention that, he gabbled hurriedly, because Shatov had no right either, to risk his life last Sunday when he attacked you, had he? I should be glad if you would make a note of that. He disappeared again without waiting for an answer. 4. Perhaps he imagined, as he made his exit, that as soon as he was left alone, Nikolai Vsyevolodovich would begin beating on the wall with his fists, and no doubt he would have been glad to see this, if that had been possible. But, if so, he was greatly mistaken. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich was still calm. He remained standing for 2 minutes in the same position by the table, apparently plunged in thought, but soon a cold and listless smile came onto his lips. He slowly sat down again in the same place in the corner of the sofa, and shut his eyes as though from weariness. The corner of the letter was still peeping from under the paperweight, but he didn't even move to cover it. He soon sank into complete forgetfulness. When Pyotr Stepanovich went out without coming to see her, as he had promised, Varvara Petrovna, who had been worn out by anxiety during these days, could not control herself, and ventured to visit her son herself, though it was not her regular time. She was still haunted by the idea that he would tell her something conclusive. She knocked at the door gently as before, and again receiving no answer, she opened the door. Seeing that Nikolai Vsyevolodovich was sitting strangely motionless, she cautiously advanced to the sofa with a throbbing heart. She seemed struck by the fact that he could fall asleep so quickly and that he could sleep sitting like that, so erect and motionless, so that his breathing even was scarcely perceptible. His face was pale and forbidding, but it looked, as it were, numb and rigid. His brows were somewhat contracted and frowning. He positively had the look of a lifeless wax figure. She stood over him for about 3 minutes, almost holding her breath, and suddenly she was seized with terror. She withdrew on tiptoe, stopped at the door, hurriedly made the sign of the cross over him, and retreated unobserved, with a new oppression and a new anguish at her heart. He slept a long while, more than an hour, and still in the same rigid pose, not a muscle of his face twitched, there was not the faintest movement in his whole body, and his brows were still contracted in the same forbidding frown. If Varvara Petrovna had remained another 3 minutes she could not have endured the stifling sensation that this motionless lethargy roused in her, and would have waked him. But he suddenly opened his eyes, and sat for 10 minutes as immovable as before, staring persistently and curiously, as though at some object in the corner which had struck him, although there was nothing new or striking in the room. Suddenly there rang out the low deep note of the clock on the wall. With some uneasiness he turned to look at it, but almost at the same moment the other door opened, and the butler, Alexey Yegorich, came in. He had in one hand a greatcoat, a scarf, and a hat, and in the other a silver tray with a note on it. 9:30, he announced softly, and laying the other things on a chair, he held out the tray with the note, a scrap of paper unsealed and scribbled in pencil. Glancing through it, Nikolai Syabolodovich took a pencil from the table, added a few words, and put the note back on the tray. "Take it back as soon as I have gone out, and now dress me," he said, getting up from the sofa. Noticing that he had on a light velvet jacket, he thought a minute, and told the man to bring him a cloth coat, which he wore on more ceremonious occasions. At last, when he was dressed and had put on his hat, he locked the door by which his mother had come into the room, took the letter from under the paperweight, and without saying a word went out into the corridor, followed by Alexei Yegorich. From the corridor they went down the narrow stone steps of the back stairs to a passage which opened straight into the garden. In the corner stood a lantern and a big umbrella. "Owing to the excessive rain, the mud in the streets is beyond anything," Alexei Yegorich announced, making a final effort to deter his master from the expedition. But opening his umbrella, the latter went without a word into the damp and sodden garden, which was dark as a cellar. The wind was roaring and tossing the bare treetops. The little sandy paths were wet and slippery. Alexei Yegorich walked along as he was, bareheaded, in his swallowtail coat, lighting up the path for about 3 steps before them with the lantern. "Won't it be noticed?" Nikolai Syabolodovich asked suddenly. "Not from the windows. Besides, I have seen to all that already," the old servant answered in quiet and measured tones. "Has my mother retired?" "Her Excellency locked herself in at 9 o'clock as she has done the last few days, and there is no possibility of her knowing anything." "At what hour am I to expect your honor?" "At 1 or half past, not later than 2. "Yes, sir." Crossing the garden by the winding paths that they both knew by heart, they reached the stone wall, and there in the farthest corner found a little door, which led out into a narrow and deserted lane, and was always kept locked. It appeared that Alexei Yegorich had the key in his hand. "Won't the door creak?" Nikolai Syabolodovich inquired again. But Alexei Yegorich informed him that it had been oiled yesterday as well as today. He was by now wet through. Unlocking the door, he gave the key to Nikolai Syabolodovich. "If it should be your pleasure to be taking a distant walk, I would warn your honor that I am not confident of the folk here, especially in the back lanes, and especially beyond the river." He could not resist warning him again. He was an old servant, who had been like a nurse to Nikolai Syabolodovich, and at one time used to dandle him in his arms. He was a grave and severe man who was fond of listening to religious discourse and reading books of devotion. "Don't be uneasy, Alexei Yegorich. May God's blessing rest on you, sir, but only in your righteous undertakings." "What?" said Nikolai Syabolodovich, stopping short in the lane. Alexei Yegorich resolutely repeated his words. He had never before ventured to express himself in such language in his master's presence. Nikolai Syabolodovich locked the door, put the key in his pocket, and crossed the lane, sinking 5 or 6 inches into the mud at every step. He came out at last into a long deserted street. He knew the town like the 5 fingers of his hand, but Bogoyavlensky Street was a long way off. It was past 10 when he stopped at last before the locked gates of the dark old house that belonged to Filippov. The ground floor had stood empty since the Lebyatkins had left it, and the windows were boarded up, but there was a light burning in Shadov's room on the 2nd floor. As there was no bell, he began banging on the gate with his hand. A window was opened and Shadov peeped out into the street. It was terribly dark, and difficult to make out anything. Shadov was peering out for some time, about a minute. "Is that you?" he asked suddenly. "Yes," replied the uninvited guest. Shadov slammed the window, went downstairs, and opened the gate. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich stepped over the high sill, and without a word passed by him straight into Kirilov's lodge. There everything was unlocked and all the doors stood open. The passage and the first two rooms were dark, but there was a light shining in the last, in which Kirilov lived and drank tea, and laughter and strange cries came from it. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich went towards the light, but stood still in the doorway without going in. There was tea on the table. In the middle of the room stood the old woman who was a relation of the landlord. She was bareheaded and was dressed in a petticoat and a hareskin jacket, and her stockingless feet were thrust into slippers. In her arms she had an 18-month-old baby, with nothing on but its little shirt, with bare legs, flushed cheeks, and ruffled white hair. It had only just been taken out of the cradle. It seemed to have just been crying, there were still tears in its eyes. But at that instant it was stretching out its little arms, clapping its hands, and laughing with a sob as little children do. Kirilov was bouncing a big red India rubber ball on the floor before it. The ball bounced up to the ceiling, and back to the floor. The baby shrieked "Bah! Bah!" Kirilov caught the "bah" and gave it to it. The baby threw it itself with its awkward little hands, and Kirilov ran to pick it up again. At last the ball rolled under the cupboard. "Bah! Bah!" cried the child. Kirilov lay down on the floor, trying to reach the ball with his hand under the cupboard. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich went into the room. The baby caught sight of him, nestled against the old woman, and went off into a prolonged infantile wail. The woman immediately carried it out of the room. "Stavrogin," said Kirilov, beginning to get up from the floor with the ball in his hand, and showing no surprise at the unexpected visit. "Will you have tea?" He rose to his feet. "I should be very glad of it, if it's hot," said Nikolai Vsyevolodovich. "I'm wet through." "It's hot, nearly boiling in fact," Kirilov declared, delighted. "Sit down." "You're muddy, but that's nothing, I'll mop up the floor later." Nikolai Vsyevolodovich sat down and emptied the cup he handed him almost at a gulp. "Some more?" asked Kirilov. "No, thank you." Kirilov, who had not sat down till then, seated himself facing him, and inquired, "Why have you come?" "On business." "Here, read this letter from Gaganov. Do you remember, I talked to you about him in Petersburg?" Kirilov took the letter, read it, laid it on the table and looked at him expectantly. "As you know, I met this Gaganov for the first time in my life a month ago, in Petersburg," Nikolai Vsyevolodovich began to explain. "We came across each other 2 or 3 times in company with other people. Without making my acquaintance and without addressing me, he managed to be very insolent to me. I told you so at the time, but now for something you don't know. As he was leaving Petersburg before I did, he sent me a letter, not like this one, yet impertinent in the highest degree, and what was queer about it was that it contained no sort of explanation of why it was written. I answered him at once, also by letter, and said, quite frankly, that he was probably angry with me on account of the incident with his father 4 years ago in the club here, and that I for my part was prepared to make him every possible apology, seeing that my action was unintentional and was the result of illness. I begged him to consider and accept my apologies. He went away without answering, and now here I find him in a regular fury. Several things he has said about me in public have been repeated to me, absolutely abusive, and making astounding charges against me. Finally, today, I get this letter, a letter such as no one has ever had before, I should think, containing such expressions as, 'the punch you got in your ugly face.' I came in the hope that you would not refuse to be my second." "You said no one has ever had such a letter," observed Kirilov. "They may be sent in a rage. Such letters have been written more than once. Pushkin wrote to Hekern. All right, I'll come." Tell me how. Nikolai Vsyevolodovich explained that he wanted it to be tomorrow, and that he must begin by renewing his offers of apology, and even with the promise of another letter of apology, but on condition that Gaganov, on his side, should promise to send no more letters. The letter he had received he would regard as unwritten. Too much concession, he won't agree, said Kirillov. I've come first of all to find out whether you would consent to be the bearer of such terms. I'll take them. It's your affair. But he won't agree. I know he won't agree. He wants to fight. Say how you'll fight. The point is that I want the thing settled tomorrow. By 9 o'clock in the morning you must be at his house. He'll listen, and won't agree, but will put you in communication with his second, let us say about 11. You will arrange things with him, and let us all be on the spot by 1 or 2 o'clock. Please try to arrange that. The weapons, of course, will be pistols. And I particularly beg you to arrange to fix the barriers at 10 paces apart, then you put each of us 10 paces from the barrier, and at a given signal we approach. Each must go right up to his barrier, but you may fire before, on the way. I believe that's all. 10 paces between the barriers is very near, observed Kirillov. Well, 12 then, but not more. You understand that he wants to fight in earnest. Do you know how to load a pistol? I do. I've got pistols. I'll give my word that you've never fired them. His second will give his word about his. There'll be 2 pairs of pistols, and we'll toss up, his or ours? Excellent. Would you like to look at the pistols? Very well. Kirillov squatted on his heels before the trunk in the corner, which he had never yet unpacked, though things had been pulled out of it as required. He pulled out from the bottom a palmwood box lined with red velvet, and from it took out a pair of smart and very expensive pistols. I've got everything: powder, bullets, cartridges. I've a revolver besides. Wait. He stooped down to the trunk again and took out a 6-chambered American revolver. You've got weapons enough, and very good ones. Very, extremely. Kirillov, who was poor, almost destitute, though he never noticed his poverty, was evidently proud of showing precious weapons, which he had certainly obtained with great sacrifice. You still have the same intentions? Stavrogin asked after a moment's silence, and with a certain wariness. Yes, answered Kirillov shortly, guessing at once from his voice what he was asking about, and he began taking the weapons from the table. When? Nikolai Vsyevolodovich inquired still more cautiously, after a pause. In the meantime Kirillov had put both the boxes back in his trunk, and sat down in his place again. That doesn't depend on me, as you know, when they tell me, he muttered, as though disliking the question, but at the same time with evident readiness to answer any other question. He kept his black, lustreless eyes fixed continually on Stavrogin with a calm but warm and kindly expression in them. I understand shooting oneself, of course, Nikolai Vsyevolodovich began suddenly, frowning a little, after a dreamy silence that lasted 3 minutes. I sometimes have thought of it myself, and then there always came a new idea: if one did something wicked, or, worse still, something shameful, that is, disgraceful, only very shameful and ridiculous, such as people would remember for 1,000 years and hold in scorn for 1,000 years, and suddenly the thought comes, one blow in the temple and there would be nothing more. One wouldn't care then for men and that they would hold one in scorn for 1,000 years, would one? You call that a new idea, said Kirillov, after a moment's thought. I didn't call it so, but when I thought it I felt it as a new idea. You felt the idea, observed Kirillov. That's good. There are lots of ideas that are always there and yet suddenly become new. That's true. I see a great deal now as though it were for the first time. Suppose you had lived in the moon, Stavrogin interrupted, not listening, but pursuing his own thought, and suppose there you had done all these nasty and ridiculous things. You know from here for certain that they will laugh at you and hold you in scorn for 1,000 years as long as the moon lasts. But now you are here, and looking at the moon from here. You don't care here for anything you've done there, and that the people there will hold you in scorn for 1,000 years, do you? I don't know, answered Kirillov. I've not been in the moon, he added, without any irony, simply to state the fact. Whose baby was that just now? The old woman's mother-in-law was here, no, daughter-in-law, it's all the same. 3 days. She's lying ill with the baby, it cries a lot at night, it's the stomach. The mother sleeps, but the old woman picks it up, I play ball with it. The ball's from Hamburg. I bought it in Hamburg to throw it and catch it, it strengthens the spine. It's a girl. Are you fond of children? I am, answered Kirillov, though rather indifferently. Then you're fond of life? Yes, I'm fond of life. What of it? Though you've made up your mind to shoot yourself. What of it? Why connect it? Life's one thing and that's another. Life exists, but death doesn't at all. You've begun to believe in a future eternal life? No, not in a future eternal life, but in eternal life here. There are moments, you reach moments, and time suddenly stands still, and it will become eternal. You hope to reach such a moment? Yes. That'll scarcely be possible in our time, Nikolai Syavolodovich responded slowly and, as it were, dreamily, the two spoke without the slightest irony. In the apocalypse the angel swears that there will be no more time. I know. That's very true, distinct and exact. When all mankind attains happiness, then there will be no more time, for there will be no need of it, a very true thought. Where will they put it? Nowhere. Time's not an object but an idea. It will be extinguished in the mind. The old commonplaces of philosophy, the same from the beginning of time, Stavrogin muttered with a kind of disdainful compassion. Always the same, from the beginning of time and never any other, Kirillov said with sparkling eyes, as though there were almost a triumph in that idea. You seem to be very happy, Kirillov. Yes, very happy, he answered, as though making the most ordinary reply. But you were distressed so lately, angry with Liputin. I'm not scolding now. I didn't know then that I was happy. Have you seen a leaf from a tree? Yes. I saw a yellow one lately, a little green. It was decayed at the edges. It was blown by the wind. When I was 10 years old I used to shut my eyes in the winter on purpose and fancy a green leaf, bright, with veins on it, and the sun shining. I used to open my eyes and not believe them, because it was very nice, and I used to shut them again. What's that? An allegory? And no, why? I'm not speaking of an allegory, but of a leaf, only a leaf. The leaf is good. Everything's good. Everything? Everything. Man is unhappy because he doesn't know he's happy. It's only that. That's all, that's all. If anyone finds out, he'll become happy at once, that minute. That mother-in-law will die, but the baby will remain. It's all good. I discovered it all of a sudden. And if anyone dies of hunger, and if anyone insults and outrages the little girl, is that good? Yes. And if anyone blows his brains out for the baby, that's good too. And if anyone doesn't, that's good too. It's all good, all. It's good for all those who know that it's all good. If they knew that it was good for them, it would be good for them, but as long as they don't know it's good for them, it will be bad for them. That's the whole idea, the whole of it. When did you find out you were so happy? Last week, on Tuesday, no, Wednesday, for it was Wednesday by that time, in the night. By what reasoning? I don't remember, I was walking about the room, never mind. I stopped my clock. It was 37 minutes past 2. As an emblem of the fact that there will be no more time? Kirillov was silent. They're bad because they don't know they're good. When they find out, they won't outrage a little girl. They'll find out that they're good and they'll all become good, every one of them. Here you found it out, so have you become good then? I am good. That I agree with, though, Stavrogin muttered, frowning. He who teaches that all are good will end the world. He who taught it was crucified. He will come, and his name will be the Man-God. The God-Man? The Man-God. That's the difference. Surely it wasn't you lighted the lamp under the icon? Yes, it was I lighted it. Did you do it believing? The old woman likes to have the lamp and she hadn't time to do it today, muttered Kirillov. You don't say prayers yourself? I pray to everything. You see the spider crawling on the wall, I look at it and thank it for crawling. His eyes glowed again. He kept looking straight at Stavrogin with firm and unflinching expression. Stavrogin frowned and watched him disdainfully, but there was no mockery in his eyes. I'll bet that when I come next time you'll be believing in God too, he said, getting up and taking his hat. Why, said Kirillov, getting up too. If you were to find out that you believe in God, then you'd believe in him, but since you don't know that you believe in him, then you don't believe in him, laughed Nikolai Vsyevolodovich. That's not right, Kirillov pondered, you've distorted the idea. It's a flippant joke. Remember what you have meant in my life, Stavrogin. Goodbye, Kirillov. Come at night, when will you? Why, haven't you forgotten about tomorrow? I'd forgotten. Don't be uneasy. I won't oversleep. At 9 o'clock. I know how to wake up when I want to. I go to bed saying 7 o'clock, and I wake up at 7 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and I wake up at 10 o'clock. You have remarkable powers, said Nikolai Vsyevolodovich, looking at his pale face. I'll come and open the gate. Don't trouble, Shadov will open it for me. Ah, Shadov. Very well, goodbye. 6. The door of the empty house in which Shadov was lodging was not closed, but, making his way into the passage, Stavrogin found himself in utter darkness, and began feeling with his hand for the stairs to the upper story. Suddenly a door opened upstairs and a light appeared. Shadov did not come out himself, but simply opened his door. When Nikolai Syavolodovich was standing in the doorway of the room, he saw Shatov standing at the table in the corner, waiting expectantly.